I guess the thing I'd like to do now is we'll talk a little bit about elections, and as we did in the first time, we'll start with some basics. Then I want to talk a little bit about, I guess really in relation to what we were just talking about, what's the rise of some of the problems, and in particularly I want to focus on the emphasis on campaigning now in the modern Congress, and I want to focus on what I call the permanent campaign phenomena. But as we go along, especially, I'm sure some of you have questions about, congressional elections or campaigns, and, just throw them out, and we'll go along and see where we end up on this one, because I want to make sure I answer any questions you might have about congressional elections while we're here. Elections, as you all know, are the principal means by which we affect democratic governance in our system. Elections are typically associated with a number of benefits and features and characteristics of our political system. The first, of course, being that elections empower citizens and give citizens the opportunity to express their views and wishes by choosing those who will hold government authority. Elections also provide citizens with a means of affirming their rights by expressing through the ballot their views and opinions on the quality of candidates and their policy preferences. Elections are the principal vehicle in which we exercise our rights as citizens and affirm our citizenship. Therefore, elections are often associated with legitimacy of the political system. One of the reasons why we have such stability and support for the political system is the fact that through elections we are able to have our voices heard, and in that way, even when we're voting out those who serve in office, we're still affirming our support of the system and thus providing greater stability to the political process. Of course, elections also, fourth, are the principal means of holding elected officials accountable for their actions. And elections are the means by which we hold individuals accountable for their behavior in Congress, for the votes they cast, and most importantly, the prospect of future elections give office holders a powerful incentive to appear as faithful, competent representatives of their constituents. At a minimum, those who want to see someone removed from office have a strong incentive to hold them accountable for their actions and thus to ensure that that element of government is fulfilled. With respect to Congress, elections are particularly important, particularly as we're talking about modern legislatures where you have party organizations within the legislature, and therefore party control is a much more important factor. Elections in terms of congressional governance have a number of major consequences. The congressional election is therefore going to determine that government has what capacity to govern. Is the election going to produce a unified government, which is going to enhance the capacity to govern and enhance to properly forge some sort of agreements and compromises? Or is the election going to produce divided government, which means that it's going to require more bipartisan coalition building or more confrontation in order for the Congress to enact any legislation? Okay? One of the things I was kind of searching for that no one came up with was it also determines the ideological composition of Congress, and whether you're going to have a Congress that tends to have more liberal or conservative members in the legislature and the effects that has on the dynamics. Okay? To wit, look at the election you just witnessed. Okay? If you think elections don't matter, I'd like one of you to explain to me how the election of candidates who advocated Tea Party principles and now serve in the United States Congress had no effect whatsoever on what's happening in the national legislature. Okay? Most of these people, many of them were not really party people. Many of them tapped into basic public attitudes that got them elected to office, often against the desires of the established parties, against the desires of established candidates, and in many cases made them competitive against some of the most powerful people in the United States Congress, including the majority leader of the United States Senate. Okay? So when the people have a clear vision and motive to participate and get out, they can bring about change. Okay? Enough of you around here probably, remember and study, and this is not new. I mean, you can go back, if you like, depending on your ilk, a prettier picture, you can go back to those wonderful days of 1974 when the United States voter got fed up with the Republican leadership of Richard Nixon and elected the Democratic Congress of 1974, the Watergate class, that completely reformed many of the laws in this country in the wake of a clear signal from the country that we were heading in the wrong direction. If you want to get deeper to something that none of us remember, we can talk about the New Deal. I mean, there are moments where there are wave elections where the public attitude manifests itself in ways that spurs turnout, spurs civic engagement, promotes changes in Congress. Okay? Now, it is the case in the modern Congress, therefore, that elections matter greatly. It is also the case that theory is very different than practice, as many of you have noted. Okay? I'll put aside all the issues about generic voter participation because that's a topic for another day, although I will say that this is not a new problem. There's been continuing problems throughout the history of the United States, too. I'm not sure it's that big a problem since large numbers of people still vote, and those who don't vote accept the results of the vote. So it seems like there's quite a bit of political legitimacy in the system. And three, the one place I would disagree is that while there are continuing problems in the casting, counting, and administration of ballots, it is much better than it's ever been in the history of the United States. It is much easier to vote now than it's ever been in the history of the United States. One of the interesting things we're seeing now in some states is some rollback of that. But for the most part, it's pretty hard not to vote if you're a U.S. citizen and want to. Given the liberalization of voting laws, absentee balloting laws, same-day registration, and the rest. Not to mention all the work you do in the student programs and the 17-year-old registration and some of the other things states have done. However, it is the case that it is clear that the congressional elections don't seem to work in some ways that the founders intended. Three things I think we can generally take as our starting point in terms of theory versus practice. First, we have the fact that there's widespread dissatisfaction with the Congress. It seems that we keep electing Congresses and we don't like them. And public approval of Congress continues to decline, currently at just about all-time lows. But a feature that we have seen as a fairly regular feature of modern government, which is the fact that we have this odd dichotomy. The public doesn't like the Congress. Generally, the Congress ranks pretty low in public opinion, yet everyone loves their congressman. For the most part, when you ask the American people, they're satisfied with their member of Congress. They like their member of Congress. They think their member of Congress represents them well. There are always going to be problems like Michigan 8 or like safe districts where they're just going to be districts that tend to be dominated by one party or another. Now, that doesn't mean that you still can't have competition in those districts. It's still the case that you can have highly competitive primaries for who gets that party mantle, which is one of the things you often see, particularly in state legislative elections. It's also the case that you can have these moments where the public rises up and wants to bring about some change, something like we saw in 2010 in some of these races with Tea Party candidates rising to the fore. You see this sometimes in state legislatures and places, I know like in Maine every once in a while where you get Green Party candidates who rise to the fore. It's a matter of is there willing to be a candidate who's going to go out there and articulate something that resonates with the public. If it resonates with the public, they can attract votes. However, the second thing that we find is that, for the most part, most people would argue that congressional elections really don't make much difference. And in this regard, moving away from safe districts, make it more broadly, you'll generally look at the statistic that 95% of the members who seek re-election get re-elected. Right? That most of the people who decide to run for office get re-elected. And I think that that highlights this broader issue of concern about the level of competition in legislative races. Why are we concerned about this? Because we're concerned about voters being able to exercise some choice or have some type of change in Congress. One of the things I think too often people conflate this statistic with change in Congress. And one of the things you have to look at underneath this is the fact that, yes, most of the members who tend to run get reelected, but you have to remember that these folks are pretty able politicians, and they tend to be very good at reading the writing on walls, so that when they think they're going to lose, they tend to retire or leave office or seek something else, so that that masks the amount of change and turnover that takes place in Congress. It masks the number of new choices that people send to Congress. For example, you can look at, let's take the period just before this very volatile period that we've seen in 2008, 2010, okay? And look at, say, 2000 to 2006, an important period in recent House elections. If we look, there are only 15 incumbents defeated during primaries during that period. And there were only 43 who were defeated in general elections. So people tend to look at that and they say, well, you see, they usually don't lose. It all benefits the incumbent. But at the same time, there are 122 members who left or retired from the Congress. And therefore, what you really had was more than a third of the Congress turning over. That more than a third of the membership changed during that period. And since then, in 2008, 2010, we've had two other of these wave elections that have seen lots of change in the Congress, so that the Congress today and its membership is very different than the Congress 10 years ago. Same thing with the Senate. Senate races tend to be much more competitive as a general rule. First, they're statewide. Second, you tend to get better candidates. More well-known candidates tend to run for Senate. Those who run for Senate usually have some political experience, previous office, and therefore there's more competition. If you look at the Senate races between 2000 and 2006, what do you find? You find that there were 2 United States senators who were defeated in primaries, and there were 15 who were defeated in the general election. But 25 retired or left office. So you had 42 new United States senators between 2000 and 2006. So that about half the Senate's turned over. So there's lots of change going on. But one of the things people focus on is how there doesn't seem to be a lot of change going on through elections. That leads to a third criticism that's often raised. And the distinction between theory and practice. And that's the argument that much too much emphasis is now placed on elections. Too much time is spent campaigning. Too much time is spent raising money. Too much time is worrying about being reelected. Winning elections is only one objective of a member of Congress. The problem that you have is that that objective is kind of the key to all the others. If you want to change public policy, pursue particular issues, try to do what you think is best for the nation, just serve constituencies as a matter of public service, you got to get elected first. And consequently, one of the things that has changed is that what used to be a requirement has now become a goal that permeates everything else and is an objective that's never far from a legislator's mind. If I were to cast one change that I've seen over the last couple decades, and that I've discussed with others, the change is not safe districts or the number of people who vote or you know, parties in Congress, or the fact that you have, you know, lots of division within the public now in terms of the policy directions of the country. You know, it's that the behavior in Congress has changed. And that change has been driven by the demands of electioneering. So that what used to be something you did during part of your term of office, you know, more and more becomes something that is constantly before you. Okay. And that's very different from a lot of other legislatures, especially if you move away from the United States context. Okay. So I think what I'll do is talk for a few minutes about these kind of three criticisms I laid out and show you how this weaves together with the changes that have occurred in legislative behavior as a result of electoral demands. Okay. And just to give you a kind of preview, some of the things you're talking about. On the one hand, you know, this drive has created more energy and more resources that are put into winning elections and mobilizing voters than we've ever seen before. Okay. On the other hand, it's created an environment, okay, to take your concerns, where even if you're in a safe district, you are still kind of constantly campaigning now. Yeah. What's one of the differences? As I was thinking about this after our discussion when we had break and stuff, and I was talking to Aaron and stuff, you know, one of the things that, you know, I thought about was, you know, if you think, you know, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, if you're from a safe district, you know, yeah, you campaigned, you know, and I've talked to a lot of the members about this. You know, I've been fortunate in just what I do. I've talked to a lot of old members, and you know, I've talked to you know, folks who served in Congress 20, 30 years, and you know, they'll tell you how, you know, 40 years ago when they first ran, especially the guys who came from pretty much Democratic district or a Republican district, you know, they really focused on constituent servicing and legislature. And one of the things was a real emphasis on, you're always concerned about getting more of the vote in the next election. So that it kind of didn't matter if you were a Democrat, Republican in their district, they were always trying to get your vote. But the campaigning was basically what you did sort of at the end of the term. You know, it got to be June of your second year, and oh, we got to start thinking about the re-election campaign, start putting the blueberry dinners on the schedule for the summer and the parades. And it was September, started raising some money, and you kind of had a 10-week campaign, and that was running for Congress. Yeah. Now, if I'm from a safe district, I am constantly electioneering and raising money all the time. That's a big difference. Okay. How do we get there? And I think it explains a lot about why people love their congressmen and don't like Congress. I think it explains a lot about incumbent re-election rates. I think it explains a lot about the rise of what I call the permanent campaign. Okay. Starts with a simple idea. We have candidate-centered campaigns. One of the things about the United States Congress and state legislatures in the United States is we have candidate-centered campaigns. Okay. That is very different from parliamentary democracies. Okay. The simple fact you begin with is that in the United States, candidates run for office. Candidates run for office, okay, as individuals. They are self-selected. In most cases, individuals decide, I'm going to run for Congress. I'm going to run for state legislature. That's very different from most democracies. Right? In a parliamentary democracy, generally the party selects candidates. The party puts together slates. They're party-based elections. You know, are we voting for the Tories or are we voting for Labor? Are we, going to be for the Social Democrats this time? Are we dissatisfied with the current conservative government and we want to change? And it's parties are responsible for the campaign. Parties tend to raise the resources for the campaign. Parties tend to recruit candidates, run slates of candidates for the campaign, right? In these democracies, candidates stand for election. I think the terminology sums it up, right? In those legislatures, candidates stand for election. In the United States, candidates run for election, right? Compete in party primaries to get access to a general election ballot where they are then named as the party nominee, okay? This means that in the United States, candidates are responsible for their own campaigns. It means generally that for the most part in the United States, with the candidate-centered campaigns, candidates are going to focus on their own constituencies and local concerns. As Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local. And therefore, all members of Congress focus on the local politics. What does that mean? It means that a lot of legislative behavior can be explained by this simple desire. Okay? Think about it, right? And what it means is that most members of Congress, I tend to be, and I'll just say, I tend to share the view that the problem is less that members of Congress are out of touch with their constituents. I tend to be more on the side that members of Congress are too in touch with their constituents. There's too much concern about what do they think, okay? There's not enough refinement and enlargement anymore. And the reason why I say that is because if you think about it, one of the things that's developed is the rise of what I call the permanent campaign. This constant concern about re-election. And how does that start? It starts with some of the changes that we see in legislative behavior that are geared towards electoral concerns. What do I mean? First, you've seen a big change in Congress over time in terms of the resources members of Congress have available to keep in touch with their constituents. And there's two sides to each coin. On the one side, this guarantees better representation and constituent servicing. On the other side, this gives a big advantage to incumbents. Okay. What do I mean? Think about some of the basics. Office and staff. If I'm an incumbent, I get a big office and staff. You don't, right? More and more staff located back in the district, In fact, if you want to plot these trends or do some things with students, a nice resource is Norm Ornstein, Tom Mann, Michael Malvin for years have done a book, Vital Statistics on Congress. Okay. I always have on my desk a copy of the newest copy of Vital Statistics on Congress, because it's one of the great cheat sheets in America. Everything you need to know about Congress, they have the numbers in the table going back, in some cases, all the way. So, one of the things, it's everything from number of staff to all the backgrounds of the members, composition of the Senate and House, how much money they spend, workload, number of bills, every fact and figure you want. And one of the things that always struck me when I was lecturing about Congress was, you look at this chart on congressional staff, and you really see how in the 60s, 70s, 80s, the number of staff grew. And the number of staff not only grew, but the share of staff that was back in the district grew, to the point where now most House members, a third of their staff is back in the district offices. Senate members have lots of staff back home in the state. On the one side, that promotes a lot of access for the public, right? As you all know, you can take yourself right into a member of Congress's office right there in the district or right there in your state and talk to somebody, right? You can bring your class there and talk to somebody, right? If you have a problem, you can go to that office and they'll do what they can to help you. They're always there to represent you. But on the other side of that is the fact that it provides this kind of permanent resource for the member of Congress. The franking privilege of free mail, okay? The trips back home to the districts, right? Under current congressional budgets, I think you get 33 trips back home now if you're a member of the House. So that's 33 weeks you're back in the district. Most members now, you know, I actually am lucky because being from Maine, you get to see your members of Congress a lot. There aren't a lot of us that have to share. More importantly, being someone who comes to Washington a lot, I'm frequently heading back on Thursday night with them to Maine. And since we're going to Maine, and there's only 34 seats in the plane, you tend to get to talk a lot. Okay? But what that shows you is the members are always going back home. Okay? They're constantly in that re-election mode. This is one of the things that has spurred so much emphasis on constituency servicing. Mail, answering phone calls, addressing the missed Social Security check, getting a flag, getting a picture for someone who wants a picture of Michelle Obama. Let's get this done, right? The other thing is more and more emphasis on getting federal resources to the district, which led over recent decades to more pork barrel behavior, more earmarks, more targeting funds to programs back home to show that you're an effective representative, you answer constituent requests, you get things done from the federal government, and you bring home money and projects to the district. Okay? On the one hand, that's all good representation if that's, you know, what a member of Congress is supposed to be doing. On the other hand, that builds up political support, trust, name recognition, media attention. I forget who it was that mentioned before you get more like media attention and resources, right? You know, you now have, you know, in the House and Senate, you know, television studios, satellite studios, C-SPAN. It's very easy to, you know, walk into the room and cut a 30-second, you know, statement for your local television news. It's very easy to, you know, just hook yourself up and be on television or radio back home in the district. It's very easy to go on C-SPAN and do those 1-minute speeches that you can now post on YouTube or on video to reach out to your constituents. Taken as a whole, that's millions of dollars in resources that a member of Congress has that their challenger does not. Okay? And it promotes behavior that focuses more on the singular interests of a district or state than on the collective interests as a whole. It encourages more representation away from, if we want to use our terms earlier, you know, the trustee model, much more towards the delegate model, if not more the mirroring model. Okay? Moreover, it affects legislative behavior in the fact that, you know, members of Congress more and more develop home styles as well as hill styles. Okay. This is, are you familiar with this concept of home style? Some of you are. Okay. This is something that developed first from Richard Fenno, very astute scholar of Congress who followed members of Congress around and started actually back in the 70s and first kind of articulated this in a book he called Home Style. That it's the idea of how members of Congress behave and portray themselves tends to be different back home than on Capitol Hill. And how their home style tends to be very focused on, you know, knowing the people and the concerns of the districts and the problems of the district and being one of them. And one of the things you can look at if you want to see this is, you know, the number of town halls members of Congress now conduct, the number of district office hours, the number of trips around the district, the amount of time they spend back home visiting different plants, businesses, organizations, groups, to show that you can trust me. I know you, I understand the people of my district. I think the most extreme case I read about, and I read quickly in a news article recently, there's a member, I think, from Illinois who's called every constituent, right? He's called like 300,000 constituents. Whenever he has time, no matter where he is throughout the day, he's always got his cell phone, and he just generates random lists of phone numbers of people back home in the district and just calls them cold to talk to them, see what they're thinking about. Okay? That type of behavior, you know, further has political benefits as you think about an election context. Okay? So that as a result, they're not only focused more on the district, but they're doing more of these listening tours, traveling the districts, getting to know everyone in their district. This type of activity promotes a lot of individual responsiveness, and it promotes a real emphasis on local concerns that helps to encourage safe re-election campaigns. At the same time, it can also serve to discourage public views of the institution, since in their home styles, many of these members tend to run against Congress rather than embrace and support the institution. Right? Especially over the course of the last decade, where there's been so much angst and concern about the government of Washington, it's much easier to run against Washington than to run with it. And as a matter of home style, you always want to show you have not become part of that aristocracy. You have not become part of that elite in Washington. Okay? We run against Washington. Which is, frankly, my favorite thing about congressional elections. I know as civic educators you find this sad, but I get some bizarre enjoyment out of the fact that people who have served 30 years in the United States Congress are running because they're a Washington outsider. Okay? As a result, what has happened is that incumbents generally start with much higher name recognition within the district. They have much greater access to resources. They have the ability to address specific problems and constituency interests. Therefore, they're in a much better position. Now, this type of legislative behavior has also now trickled into much greater continual electioneering behavior. And this is what I mean by the rise of the permanent campaign. Okay. Elections, as you all know, become more expensive. Lots of reasons for that. Okay. One is, in a candidate-centered campaign, the candidate themselves, him or herself, is responsible for raising the money for the campaign. As campaigns have developed, particularly over the course of the last 30 years, what have you seen? Congressional elections have started to adapt the methods used in higher level races, and there tends to be greater cost. Their constituencies are getting bigger. Now on average you got, what, 670,000 people, 500,000 voting age population in a congressional district. That's a lot more people trying to reach out and contact. Much more use of television and radio, particularly in Senate campaigns. In the House, it's mail that tends to be increasingly expensive. People think campaigns, they think television and radio, but in actually a lot of House races, that doesn't really play any role. Because if I'm a House member from New York, I'm not going to buy New York City TV for my congressional race. It makes no sense, right? If I'm in Philadelphia, if I'm in New Jersey, where I don't even have my own television station, I have to buy Philadelphia or New York television to reach New Jersey. It's too expensive, right, for a congressional candidate. They tend to do mail. Mail's expensive. What's more important now is less those types of resources than just campaign funding. Because as you start to get more used to these techniques, what you've seen is the increased professionalism of campaigns. Campaigns now have their own staffs. They have their own consultants. They tend to have pollsters. They tend to have fundraising and media consultants more and more. This has drastically driven up the cost of campaigns. Okay. Consequently, members of Congress need to raise more money. Since they're limited in the money they can raise, they have to start raising money earlier. Right? Under federal election campaign law, you know, up until 2002, a member of Congress could only receive $1,000 per election from an individual or $5,000 from a political action committee per election. So I can get $1,000 for the primary election, $1,000 for the general election, a total of $2,000. Well, if I used to, you know, raise $50,000 and now I got to raise $150,000, I got to go out and get more contributions. That means I got to spend more time raising money. Okay. More people. Or I got to raise more money more efficiently. Okay. Now, an individual can give me $1,000, but there's not a lot of individuals out there with $1,000 to give me. So that means I'm going to have to go out and raise, you know, $20, $50 contributions. Or perhaps I can get money from a political action committee here in Washington that can give me $5,000 per election or $10,000 total. And surprise, surprise, members of Congress started to focus more on political action committees as their source of funding. So what happened was members of Congress started more and more to raise money, but what was important was they started to raise money earlier and earlier and earlier. So that if you look since 1979, particularly if you look in the last 15 years, the amount of money raised in the year before an election has grown dramatically. And the amount of money raised in the first 6 months of a House member's term has risen dramatically. The amount of money raised by a Senate candidate in year 1 or 2 has risen dramatically. You know, particularly now in these Senate races where they're looking at having to raise $10, $15, $20 million. If you got to do that in $5,000 and $2,500 chunks, you've got to start very early. And therefore, what's happened is that more and more time is spent on the electioneering. Okay, that led to then, I think, 3 things that have really changed things in the last few election cycles. You know, people tend to ask me, you know, why does it seem to have gotten so bad lately? And I think that there were a couple of developments that have taken place. Okay. First, okay, as we said at the top, elections determine majority control. Majority control then determines all kinds of things, most importantly the leadership of the body, agenda, whether you have unified or divided government. Okay. As party line voting has increased in Congress, particularly in, you know, the period, say, since '94 when the Republicans returned to power in the Congress and you started to have more and more closer Congresses, the fight for majority control became more intense. And therefore, party line voting was reinforced more and more because we've got a slim majority, we've got to hold on to our majority, which meant that those races where there was a chance of change became increasingly important to both sides. Right? And there was basically a pool of about 30 to 55 seats in any given election that were going to determine who had majority control. Okay. Consequently, the parties had a vested interest in making sure they had good candidates and won those seats. And the parties started to raise ever-increasing sums of money to spend in those elections. Okay. Because parties can spend money in support of their candidates. In fact, the political parties can spend unlimited amounts in support of their candidates as long as they don't coordinate with the candidate. So now you had the candidates working more with the parties in alliance. Okay. What did this mean? This meant 2 things. One, I knew I'd get to you eventually. Okay. Who can raise the most money? Incumbent. Who can really raise the most money? No, but if amongst incumbents, who's going to really raise the most money? Leadership. Well-established members. Members who probably have safe districts. Members who really don't have to spend a lot of money on their campaigns. What did you start to see? These members started to raise more and more money. Why? Because any money a member raises in their campaign committee account, they can transfer unlimited amounts to the party. If I have $2 million in my campaign fund and I don't need it, I can give it to the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, say, you use it. It's all regulated federal money. I took it, and here, the party can use it. So what happened? Parties started to impose on members of Congress quotas, basically, of needing to raise money for the party to help them in the races where they needed to win for majority control. So suddenly, members who in the past might not have spent a lot of time raising money had more demands on them to raise money for the party. Okay. Then what happened was members of Congress started to form their own PACs, called leadership PACs, where they could raise money for this separate committee that they could then give to individuals running in these races to help them try to win so that they could get more Democrats or more Republicans in Congress. Now we have Citizens United. Okay. What's happening now? On top of all this is you had the Supreme Court. Are you all familiar with Citizens United? Yes? We're good? Okay. You had the Citizens United decision, which now said corporate money and labor union treasury funds, which had basically been prohibited from use in federal elections since 1947, can now be spent advocating candidates. So that was okay. And then it got combined with another court case called SpeechNow.org versus Federal Election Commission, which was a federal district court case that said, if you're an independent group spending money in federal elections, there's no reason to impose contribution limits on the money you receive. Since you're not giving money to candidates, you can raise money under the First Amendment. It's your right to give as much money to that group, and that group can spend the money advocating candidates. With me?
Yeah.
So now I got a nice twofer. I can get corporate and labor union money in unlimited amounts and put it in this separate committee, and that committee can then spend money in congressional races. The issue was this. If we're a committee that's only spending money independent of candidates, and the court has said it's my right under the First Amendment to spend money advocating a candidate, why can't a group of us get together and spend money advocating a candidate? If there's no limit on how much an individual can spend out of his or her own pocket, why should there be a limit when a bunch of us get together and spend money out of our own pockets?
So doesn't that render a PAC obsolete?
See, this is why he does so well. So why now should I have a PAC limited to $5,000 from individuals and contributions that can then give $5,000 per election to a candidate? Why not set up an independent expenditure-only committee, or what the media now calls, and you're going to read a lot about this. This is the only reason why I'm boring you with all these details. This is what the 2012 elections are going to be all about. Super PACs.
Oh, that's the term.
That's what a super PAC is. Super PAC, which is a group that is only going to spend money independently. We are not going to give any contributions to candidates. But I may go into a congressional race and spend $200,000 on advertising to help elect a candidate. Supreme Court says this is permissible. It doesn't corrupt the candidate, because as long as you're not giving money to the candidate, there's no risk of corruption.
And the candidate can't consult with you, obviously.
Right. The candidate cannot coordinate with you. Okay? But this is why you'll see most super PACs are run by people like Karl Rove, because they don't need to consult with the candidate to know what congressional election. Frankly, we don't need to consult. If we formed our own super PAC, I think with just one Google search, we could pretty much figure out what are the 30 congressional races that are going to matter where we need to spend money. Okay? So as a result, what's happened now, candidates are raising even more money because now they're concerned not about just the spending of their opponents, but now what they're concerned about is, gee, there's going to be party money coming in, there's going to be these super PACs coming in. I mean, some of these super PACs are planning to raise $100 to $120 million for 2012. And so, you know, in the last election, you had 100 congressional races where the PAC spent more than one of the candidates. So they're becoming a much bigger voice in these elections. I think it's a very dangerous trend because, you know, I know the Supreme Court likes to tell me that spending money doesn't corrupt candidates, but I'm like old-fashioned, and I think, you know, if a guy sees like $250,000 in television dropped on his head, or what's happening now, and I bet Norm will talk about this, is if you're a member of Congress and someone says, well, you know, if you vote this way, I understand there's a group that's going to be advertising against candidates who take this position. That's a very different dynamic in legislative behavior. I think that that's a concern. If you look at these congressional elections now, you know, what are you seeing? Okay, you kind of have two streams, right? There was the old stream of what you might take from your textbooks, where members of Congress, incumbents tended to raise a lot of money. They tended to raise it from larger donors and political action committees, that challengers tended to be underfunded. You know, and this is one of the problems, getting back to safe districts. Part of the problem you have is that, you know, it's a situation where it's feast or famine. If you are, you know, an incumbent, you're going to have plenty of money. Most challengers have great difficulty raising money because they're not expected to win. In those races that are toss-ups, there's huge amounts of money now. I mean, huge amounts of money, because that's where everyone puts their money. Okay. Then there was another stream of, could this stream actually end up being overcome by new technology, small donors, internet fundraising, you know, the Obama example, right? That $10 from hundreds of thousands of people can make a difference. If you look at the Tea Party, that was a big difference. I mean, you look at someone like Sharron Angle in Nevada, or Michelle Bachmann, who I've been looking at a lot lately for various reasons. She raised $13 million running for House of Representatives. She raised more money than the Speaker of the House of the United States. Okay? That's hard to do. And half of it came from small contributions from all around the country. You know? Same thing with Sharron Angle, raised millions of dollars from small donors from around the country. So one of the issues was, you know, this small donor revolution kind of coming that will start supporting different kinds of candidates than the traditional kind of party candidates. And is this the kind of creative destruction we're going to see in fundraising now? If you're a candidate with some good ideas, who people start to get to know and like, they can respond to you, and you don't need to be wired into this world of money. One, I think, of the big questions now facing us as an electoral system is this new stream of big money going to tamper the enthusiasm and movement of the emerging stream of small money? Or will the crowding effect of the small money be able to compete with the big money? I thought that the small money was kind of the future until the Citizens United decision. You know, I think the Citizens United decision is very dangerous in terms of the notion of how can my $20 matter when, you know, these companies are going to spend a lot of money. But that's what's going on right now. And I think that that's another aspect of the whole competition kind of changing mix we're going to see. We're just at the cusp because we don't see it, but these changing technologies give challengers access to the public and means of distributing message and social networking that never existed before. You know, 15 years ago, if I wanted to run a congressional campaign, I wanted to mail 100,000 people, I had to figure out, well, how am I going to get $1.04 to build the package, and then the mail costs, and it's $1.68 a piece. I need $168,000 to mail people. You know, now I can send out 100,000 emails along social networks and using viral messaging of the core 100 people I know in a way that was never possible before. Now, will that start to affect the dynamics of elections and bring a more populist attitude, bring more people into the process? That's one of the things we kind of have to wait and see. I mean, right now it's not a good moment to test that because there's such disapproval of Congress. But what you're seeing now is some effects where, you know, the electorate is swinging around back and forth. You know, in 2006, they kind of gave the Democrats a chance. They didn't like it. They didn't fix it. So they swung back to the Republicans. In 2010, you saw a lot of the Tea Party activism in certain states. You're going to see more of that disruption for a while because we're in one of these periods of kind of wave elections where the public, you know, is not simply looking at candidates and their kind of the incumbents and that sort of thing. And I think the place where it really affects this is if you look at the political context, most of the people who are going to run for Congress are strategic politicians, right? So that one of the biggest things that affects congressional elections is, I think, less the money and some of these other factors than the difficulty of getting good challengers against incumbents. Because most of the individuals who have political experience, who've been state legislators, who have a good basis for running for Congress, don't want to run and lose, so they wait for their opportunities. They act as strategic politicians, and they tend to run when an incumbent retires, when an incumbent looks weak, or when the macro political conditions are favorable to their party. So what does that mean? The macro conditions that tend to determine these congressional waves tend to be, as you might expect, public dissatisfaction with Congress, the public's conception of the state of the economy and whether the nation's heading in the right direction or wrong direction, presidential approval, presidential election year when you're going to have a higher turnout, the year after a redistricting, when suddenly the lines have been scrambled again and a lot of incumbents suddenly have new voters. That's when you traditionally have tended to see elections where more incumbents end up being defeated. Okay? All of those factors are in play right now. And I think what you're seeing, therefore, is us entering this very volatile period in congressional elections. And I think what you're also seeing is kind of good testament of the problems you have in the modern Congress and why these elections matter. Because if you look at the dynamic of the Congress right now, you know, it's much more than the change in party leadership. You know, what's really changed is, in particular, the Tea Party members, or those who pledged to different Tea Party principles who were elected, have really changed the dynamics of the majority party. And that, combined with some liberal Democrats who are from very safe districts, you know, has really made it difficult to craft any type of compromise, particularly when you're trying to craft a compromise on what the people don't want, which is austerity. They all want less government. They all want less government spending. They all want lower taxes. We all agree on that. So, okay, the hard measures needed to get there, there's no coalition for. And I think, therefore, you know, one of the problems is that Congress is monitoring the folks back home so closely. And how do elections matter? Enough members have taken the pledge that they would never raise taxes, or they would be for a balanced budget amendment, or they would cut the deficit, that they're not leaving themselves any room for compromise. And that's why this morning I said I think the biggest problem in Congress right now is the ideology, not parties, not the other things. Because when you stake out those positions, you don't leave yourself room for compromise. There's no room for the deliberation. There's no room to adapt to the national needs, and it makes it much harder to get something done. That's why this, as I noted, emphasis of elections on local concerns has become so important, even in this nationalized context of elections, because incumbents generally believe the way you defend yourself against these big wave elections is by being the local representative. And that's why those challenging them often try to force you to be the Washington insider versus me, the outsider. In some ways, in congressional elections, the strategies are kind of simple. You know, it's about our qualities as candidates, and for the incumbent, it's about I'm with you, not them. I have been an effective representative, and challengers wanting to be the outsider against the insider, right? I mean, if you look at all these races where major incumbents were challenged, say, by Tea Party candidates or Democrats who did well in 2006, the whole dynamic was, you know, they've been in Washington too long, the Washington outsiders, we need to change. Okay. And the common ground is the public believes we need a change. The public believes government's not working right now. The public believes Congress isn't working right now. They're very frustrated with Congress. And, you know, I think that if the current Congress doesn't work, you're going to see a lot more change again in 2012, and they're going to try something else. So as my students like to say, a lot of the regulations supported by Corrado were struck down by the Supreme Court, but that's good for Corrado and bad for the country, because now there'll be more money for him to study, and it's bad for Corrado, for the country. So they like to say bad for the country, good for Corrado. Any other questions before we depart? Well, thank you for your time and patience.